my voice from the microphones of our presenters who are also here in the library today. So happy June 19th, everybody. Welcome to CGL. It's a pleasure to be here for our second in our series of St. Thomas Graphics Collection presentations. It's funded again in part by a grant received from the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands with funding provided by the National Endowment of Humanities CARES Act. Thank you very much. Today's presentation, again titled The Body of the Virgin Islands Women, Queens, Debutantes, and Virgins, is going to draw on images from the St. Thomas Graphics Collection. And the members of the Virgin Islands Studies Collective who are here today, both in person and remotely, will discuss the representations of Virgin Islands women in Carnival, debutante balls, and tourist publications, and I think a couple other surprises. The Virgin Islands Studies began in 2017 as a series of conversations between Miss Vaugh Belle, Miss Tami Navarro, Dr. Tami Navarro, Dr. Hadiya Sewer, and Professor Tiphanie Yanique. The Virgin Islands Studies Collective is centrally concerned about the erasure of Virgin Islands from larger discourses and the lack of the resources to attend to the Virgin Islands community's needs. Notably, there's the continuous colonial subjection, lack of cultural institutions to preserve Virgin Islands history, exception of CGL, of course, and the ecological precarity demonstrated by the recent hurricanes Irma and Maria. Collective member Professor Yanique is a celebrated author. An example of her many awards and prizes is her poetry collection, Wife, which won the 2016 Bocas Prize in Caribbean Poetry. She's currently an associate professor at Emory University, and her next novel, Monster in the Middle, will be published this October. Ms. Belle is a visual artist who explores the material culture of coloniality with counter-visualities and narratives in both in video, performance, painting, and installation and writing, among other media. She has exhibited across the Caribbean, United States, and Europe, and featured in a wide range of media, including New York Times, Vice, The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. She holds an MFA from the Instituto Superior de Arte in Havana, Cuba, and an MA and a BA from Columbia University in New York. Dr. Sewer is a research fellow in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University. She earned her PhD in African Studies from Brown University, and as a community engaged scholar, she is also president and co-founder of the St. John Heritage Collective, a land rights and cultural heritage preservation nonprofit. And finally, Dr. Navarro is the associate director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. As a cultural anthropologist, she has extensive publications and serves on the board of the St. Croix Foundation. She's also co-host of the podcast Writing Home, American Voices from the Caribbean. Now, I know everyone wants to get started with today's presentation, so I have significantly condensed the remarkable biographies of today's presenters. So full bios will be available at CGL's St. Thomas Graphics Collection website for this event. A link to that page is already posted in the chat. We'll put that there again in a bit. On that page, you can also find full scans of selected publications from the St. Thomas Graphics Collection and links to the entire graphics collection. Today, the VISCO, is that what you say? You call it VISCO? The VISCO members will interrogate the range and limits of the Virgin Islands woman's beauty and power, as well as how the Virgin Islands woman has balanced native and local ideals of strength and beauty under the gaze of tourist and American and European ideals of femininity. The presentation will start with short talk from each of the members of the collective, followed by a roundtable discussion. We will then proceed to a question and answer moderated by Dr. Sewer. Dr. Navarro, if you want to start sharing the slides now, or Ms. Belle? Yeah. I'll finish up my introduction while you get ready. During this conversation, all the attendees will be muted, but please feel free to post your questions into the chat, and Dr. Sewer will be monitoring that for the discussion period afterwards. If you missed our first event presented by Susan Lugo, you can view it at CGL's YouTube channel, but be aware today's presentation is also going to be recorded and uploaded shortly after we conclude. So look for that later. We do expect to wrap up before 4 p.m. So everyone's settled in? Okay, I'd first like to start off by passing the screen to Professor Yanique.
Thank you, Rob. I am very excited to be here with my fellow Virginal Studies Collective members. Lavon, you can go back to the introductory slide. Thank you. I do want to thank Mr. Upson, Rob, for hosting us, for reaching out to us, for letting us use the space, and thank you also to Sophia Abin for all the work that she does and for her introduction. I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about what our presentation is going to be as a whole, and then I will launch into my individual presentation. So good afternoon to everyone. I'm Tiphanie Yanique. As I said, we're excited to be here presenting perspectives on the St. Thomas Graphics collection of the Caribbean Genealogy Library. Our presentation, our group presentation today is called The Body of the Virgin Islands Women, Queens, Debutantes, and Virgins. And as the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, we do work on the Virgin Islands broadly, using the theories of Blackness and feminism as our lens and working within and against what we call the archive. I want to emphasize this word, the archive, because when we use it, we refer to it as the materiality of history. We are referring to the artifacts of the past, things that might speak to us about who we are as Virgin Islanders, who we were, who we are right now, and who we might be to ourselves and to the world. Archives are often hyper protected, hidden from the very people who might most desire them. And in the case of the Virgin Islands, our archives are housed all over the world. As many of you might know, they're in Copenhagen, Denmark, they're in Philadelphia, United States. And actually one of our earliest archival interventions as members of VISCO was when Dr. Navarro, myself, and Mr. Rob Upson were in New York in the naval records of the Virgin Islands, which are housed in New York City. And we had to have, special access with which Mr. Robson helped us gain. But it was a sign of how overprotected these archives are. They were not held in the Virgin Islands, and then you had to have a particular kind of cachet to be able to access them. We understand our role as VISCO as being to interject into the archive. We think of our scholarship, activism, and artistry as making new archives, as a kind of act of rebellion. We understand that CGL does not use the word archive to refer to their collections. We celebrate this, admire this. We think this is wonderful because that means that the Genealogy Library calls its holdings collections so that they're not hidden, that they have an availability, that they are easily accessible. We, however, will probably still use the word archive in our presentation, and I wanted to signal that because we do it to sort of emphasize that the reality that most of our history is still hidden to us, and that this hiddenness of this material is particular to places that are colonized, and that actually CGL is an exception by having a collection versus a sort of hidden, buried archive. We also chose to have our event on this date, June 19th, with serious intention. We all know now that this is a federal holiday if we pay attention to the news, but that's really new. So, just really quickly, because I think we all have a lot of ideas about what this day represents now, but June 19th, 1865 is the day when slaves in Texas realized that they actually were no longer slaves and actually hadn't legally been slaves for almost 2 years. That is when they were told that they were free. Here in the Virgin Islands, we were freed from slavery a generation earlier, and we were pretty much aware of it immediately because we kind of took it under the duress of rebellion. But as Americans, we were also, and we are also in kinship with our fellow Americans who were not freed, as I said, until a generation later, and many who didn't know until 2 years later. They were already free, but their freedom was hidden from them, which is a similar connection to how we understand the archives to often be hidden from us. And so doing this work on June 19th felt very symbolic and metaphoric to us as a way to unearth something that has been hidden. My focus in my presentation will be on the physical body of the gendered physical Virgin Islands woman, but we will be talking both about the physical woman as well as about metaphoric womanhood and the land as gendered female, gendered virgin, debutante, or queen. So my presentation is called Freedom, Beauty, and Black Women's Pursuits in the Caribbean. I'll repeat that: Freedom, Beauty, and Black Women's Pursuits in the Caribbean. I don't know if Robbie could put that in the chat, maybe.
Sure.
Also next slide. Not as yet. I do want to remind you guys that Dr. Sewer will be managing our Q&A, and if you have questions, to put those questions directly into the chat, and Dr. Sewer will scan them and select the questions. Okay. In an article in the New York Times published in May 12th of 2021, we learned that in 2008, archaeologists in Egypt on an excavation site between Luxor and Cairo found human remains from the 14th century BC with intact hairstyles. Some of those folks had hairstyles where they had 70 braids. Many of them had extra human hair, basically weaves added for fullness and length, worked into it in such a way that easily allowed the owner of this hair to remove the extensions, put new ones in, update their hairstyles. These weren't queens, these were regular Egyptian men and women who were paying attention and valuing adornment and beauty. And we often think of braids and putting in extra hair as a modern phenomenon. We often critique it as being sort of a calling for whiteness, but this 2008 archaeology site sort of shows that from 14th century BC, African people have been thinking about adornment and beauty and using it to value themselves in different kinds of ways. The Caribbean in particular is full of stories of Black women who freed themselves from slavery in part by using their beauty. Zica da Silva of Northern Brazil, who I myself bring into modern times in my story, Kill the Rabbits, which is published in my collection, How to Escape from a Leper Colony. She's a good example of that. My story, Kill the Rabbits, is based on a jam band song called Legal. It's actually an Eddie and the Movement song, but we know Eddie and the Movements to be jam band by now. And in that story, I highlight a character who I call Zika, who's based on the historical Zica da Silva. Another very prominent example of this is someone whose name is Dolly Coran Thomas. She's a woman of Montserrat, one of the most successful business leaders of her time of any race or gender. And this was actually during the time of slavery. Both these women had been slaves and managed, based on their beauty and intelligence, to gain leadership in the islands. And Dolly Coran is celebrated in a book by Vanessa Riley called Island Queen that isn't out yet, but I recommend it. It'll be out in a couple of months. Freeing slaves wasn't free. I don't know if people realize that. The slave owner had to pay, or the slave herself had to pay the government. And this was to keep slaves from just getting free, or to keep slave owners from freeing their slaves out of guilt, and basically to prevent the whole... to prevent, the islands being inundated with a bunch of free Black people walking around. But there were many, many free... So just so you know, we're next to an art gallery, and the art gallery is doing some artwork, it sounds like, next door to us. So that's what we're hearing next door. There were many, many free Black women in the Caribbean during the time of enslavement. In fact, there were more free Black women than men, many more. More free Black women in the Caribbean percentage-wise, actually, than anywhere else where there was chattel slavery at the time. Indeed, when the Governing Council of Montserrat tried to raise the manumission fee, which is the price that had to be paid to free enslaved persons, there was protests. Nobody wanted the fee risen. The white slave owners in Montserrat protested in particular because they wanted it to be easy to free their slaves, but not just any slaves. They wanted to be able to free their female slaves. And in their own writing, this was to, quote, reward female slaves for their love and loyalty and service. That's a direct quote. Now, we hearing that quote now, as anyone probably hearing the quote then, would understand that love, loyalty, and service meant that these women were probably mistresses, concubines, perhaps even sometimes illegitimate wives. But these women were, of course, slaves until that manumission fee was paid. and they would not have had much choice in selecting their sexual mates, and certainly no choice if the master picked them. But often these women use this, their attractiveness, their sexual desirability, to gain power. The Caribbean in particular has numerous stories of women of color gaining freedom for themselves, their entire families, grandparents, cousins, much less children and siblings, once they built their own financial empires and became leaders in the community, and then they could afford the manumission fee for their families. In many ways, their beauty allowed for this freedom, which allowed for other types of power. Betsy Resende, who's actually on the Zoom with us today, is a local VI historian, and she writes in her dissertation, one that lost members of Viscos have often relied on, that in the Virgin Islands during and post-slavery, Black and colored Virgin Islands women were forbidden adornment by law. Women of color in the Virgin Islands were not allowed to wear jewelry, tulle, lace, etc., because it seems white women specifically were complaining to the authorities that this attention that women of color were given to their beauty was giving women of color too much power. Black women in the Caribbean, in the Virgin Islands in particular, did not need a campaign of Black beauty to know that we were indeed beautiful. We knew it. In fact, it was powerful and dangerous. Black women who had freed themselves or who were the descendants of freed women were often heads of households, their sons, brothers, husbands, all employed on their dime. This might be, that Black women were not, as perhaps was the case for our stateside or counterparts on other maybe Spanish or French speaking islands, not necessarily succumbing to the machismo or Caribbean patriarchy that we often assume, I think too easily, to be part of Caribbean culture. I want to resist that easy assumption. I also want to resist the assumption, again, one prevalent in the US, that Black women's bodies were not considered beautiful by white or even Black standards of beauty. The Caribbean reality shows this to be patently false. Black women's bodies were assumed beautiful. Black women's beauties were an incredible threat. And now, Levon, you can show the cartoon. So here's an image of a Black woman who is loving up with Prince William, who will later become King William IV of Britain. This is from 1788. And one thing we can see in this presentation, in this image, is that the Black woman is presented as beautiful. She's in a loving embrace with the future king. She's not caricatured. They're looking at each other tenderly. He holds her hand to his chest. It's very romantic. She hugs around his shoulders. This is during a time when Black people, particularly Black men, were often presented as buffoons and caricatures. Here is an image with a Black woman and a white man, a man of aristocratic, the future king indeed, in which she is being presented as beloved and beautiful. Black women gain this power by what I call aesthetic code switching. They learn the fashion and dances of Europe in order to move in those societies, make business deals. So knowing that men made deals in brothels in the Caribbean women would own the brothels. Knowing that men made deals in hotels or restaurants in the Caribbean women would own the hotels and the restaurants. Now the next image is the cover of a, thank you, Levon, of a debutante ball from 2004. It's from the Eta Phi Beta Sorority Alpha Chi chapter, which put on the debutante balls for generations and maybe actually still does. This is part of the St. Thomas graphics collection, which we're all presenting on today. I want to go over this image in detail, and I actually have a copy of it here too, so you can see it. I might point to it as we go. On the left, you see a very, on my left, I'm not sure how the image is maybe switched around for you guys, but we see what is probably, we can assume is a very European image. We might assume that the guy's hair looks like it's styled in a European manner. He's probably, assumed white, both of them, based on bodies and hair and that. On the right, however, on my right, there is a series of Black women, very brown-skinned Black women, some of them dark-skinned, their hair is in curls, their hair is in braids, some of them have the extensions in their hair. The extensions are sometimes braided in, sometimes weaved in. Some of the girls have natural hair. You can see this girl on the bottom. natural hair with her own braids coming down. Various representations of Black women's beauty, all kinds of various types of Black beauty up against the image of the white European beauty. But I would note the white European beauty is in silhouette. The Black girls are clearly dominant in the image. They are in color. They are bejeweled. I would also, note that they are actual persons, individual people in the image, whereas the image of whiteness is, these are archetype, they're not persons, right? They're just cartoons. The girls are also not overly sexualized. We often think of Black beauty as being very sexualized beauty. Here we only see the girls from neck up. And so although they are painted as beautiful and even desirable, the debutante ball is often about virginity and coming of age. And here we only see their faces, right? So a kind of beauty that is only about their faces. I want to focus on this because I want to present the idea that Black women in the Caribbean were not solely used for their beauty, although of course slavery meant that women were used all the time for their bodies, but also that Black women used their beauty and continue to do so, just as they used, as we use, our knack for business, our social skills, our leadership skills to overcome the white patriarchy embodied under slavery, colonialism, after slavery, and even now in our current colonialism. Debutante balls in the Virgin Islands, perhaps different than cotillions in the US, were spaces, maybe are still spaces, for Black young women to assert power and to confirm their future leadership. The St. Thomas Graphics collection helps make this plain. The cotillion or debutante ball is a European tradition, usually of young girls of aristocratic birth being presented to the community as available to date. So this is like they're virgins and they're making the transition into adulthood. The balls are preceded by classes in etiquette. You learn how to walk, dance, entertain, basically to prepare you for formal dating, perhaps to prepare you for your future as a duchess or a princess or a queen, an adult aristocratic life. Here in the Virgin Islands, many young women participate in the annual Deb balls as preparation indeed for becoming queen, because you do the Deb ball in part to prepare you for running for Queen show or for other pageants at your schools. And I'll turn to the final image. This image is taken from page 52 of the 1995 Debutante booklet. And this actually is me. This was the year that I was a Deb, which is what we called ourselves. We call ourselves Debs. And the year after, I would indeed run in and win my school's Queen show. I went to All Saints and I was Miss All Saints the year after. In the image, my hair is pressed and curled. I have an earring showing off that I'm certain is not my earring. I didn't own such fancy things. But I'm wearing a necklace, which is the same necklace that I own right now. I've had it for over 20 years. There are feathers abounded. They were given to all of us. So we all had the same feathers. I remember in this picture that I'm wearing eyeliner for the very first time in my life. My name is different. The Gundel is my stepfather's last name. The Y is the Y of my last name, Yanique, which is what I use now. I no longer use the Gundel, but I use the Yanique, which is the Y there. And underneath it, you see my grandmother's name, and my grandfather's name, and my mother's name. It was very important. All the Debs had to say who was their sponsor, which is who paid for them to be. And then they had to say who were their parents, because it was very important to know where you came from and who you belong to. However, if we were to read this passage, and I'm not encouraging you to read, it's not my best piece of literature ever. There are a few key things that happen in the write-up. In the second paragraph, I call myself a dedicated leader, and I list all my leadership positions. I'm highlighting this because we often, again, think of the debutante ball or representations of beauty as about weakness and frivolity, but actually all the debutantes have the word leader in their description about who they are. And I look through this booklet and many of the booklets to confirm this. In this booklet, everybody has the word leader or its derivative, leadership. I am a leader. I'm part of a group of leaders in their bio. we were encouraged to write our bios ourselves, and yet everybody put something about being a leader. It appears in every statement. We were also asked to write what we will become in the future, which again, who are you going to be, right? And in my third paragraph, I say that I will be an English professor, which is indeed what I am now. So the Debutante Ball was a space to sort of claim your leadership, claim who you're going to be in the world. And in the case of many of us, in 1995, some of these women are still my friends, and they said they were going to become lawyers, and they became lawyers. They were going to become nurses, and they became nurses. So it was not only a representation of beauty, it was beauty as a source or as one element of power, using as part of our power to become leaders in the future. So I went first today in our presentation on queens, debutantes, and virgins, and I'm that one on debutantes. I'm presenting this idea that freedom and beauty is really about the transition space from virgin perhaps, innocence, to queen, leader. And that's the debutante space, the deb space. The argument that I'm making is that this space is about a taking on of power and a claiming of your leadership, and that Black women in the Caribbean have never shied away from using our beauty as part of that. And this collection, the St. Thomas Graphics collection, helps make that plain. Thank you so much.
You're muted. I'll start that again. So thank you so much. My name is Vaugh Belle, and I am going to be the second presenter from VSCO. I'm a visual artist, so a lot of my presentation will be very image heavy, and also thinking through the St. Thomas Graphics collection in relation to my own work. So the first image that I've chosen, well, actually both images I've chosen are dealing with the power of reenactment and reconfiguration. Reenactment as a restaging or a recreation, the act of doing and doing again. Reenacting past events, actions, positionalities activates a space of possibility and becoming. This kind of embodied knowledge can also fill in the gaps and silences of colonial archives and mend the fractures and ruptures of the shattered colonial histories that we all inhabit. In this first image, we have Queen Kozaya. It's a playbill from a premiere that occurred on St. Thomas. It was choreographed by Monty Thompson. And I believe the main dancer in the image, it looks like Curlis Solomon to me. And she is, in effect, reenacting Queen Kozaya, who is one of the leaders of the coal carrier strike that occurred on St. Thomas in 1892. And I decided to pair this image with the monument project that Jeanette Ehlers, the Danish artist, and myself, that we've embarked upon since probably around, well, separately from 2014-15, and together we inaugurated the first version of the sculpture in Copenhagen in March 31st of 2018. And reenactment has been a central part of the process in I Am Queen Mary. Jeanette's and my body were separately scanned. They were separately scanned as we recast ourselves, first in Huey P. Newton's iconic image in a peacock chair with a sword and a rifle, and inserting our bodies into the history of the Black Panthers was a transnational connection to other resistance movements while centering a female figure. Of course, with the title, I Am Queen Mary, we are also reenacting Mary Thomas, who was one of the main leaders of the 1878 labor revolt on St. Croix. We later, I just actually want to show this image just to kind of see a sense of the reenactment. Hopefully that will come through on the streaming. So both Jeanette and myself positioned ourselves in this image, and we were both scanned. This is a 3D body scan. Oops, how do I move it? We were then kind of rematerialized into the digital space. And then we created a hybrid, not only of our two monument projects, but we created a hybrid of our bodies to create an allegorical portrait of Mary Thomas. Here's another image of the process of hybridization. And here's an image of the two versions of the sculpture that exist today. In many ways, what we're doing, it's not just, as I mentioned, an individual reenactment, but it's a joint reenactment, as we are inviting the viewers to also step into this history, but through the title, I Am Queen Mary. So it's also asking the viewer, what is your relationship to this history? Another key point that I want to mention is that this idea of reenactment that we see in the St. Thomas Graphics collection of the Playbill of Queen Kosaya, in addition to I Am Queen Mary, presents another aspect of ancestral queendom, which is essential to Virgin Islands identity. These reenactments of queendom are a form of self-making. And to quote from my section of our joint article that we did about ancestral queendom, Reflections on the Prison Records of the Four Rebel Queens of 1878, of the fire burn in St. Croix, our queens are very different from the ones that we learn about in the storybooks. Our queens are made, whether they be queens of pageants, carnivals, labor revolts, or slave rebellions, through your own fashioning, determination, your own work and imagination, you can lead yourself into a realm and become the kind of queen that is impossible to dethrone and impervious to invasion. Our queen means that you are your own empire. Now, I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit, and I think although our presentation is definitely about the body, I wanted to pivot and think about some other images that came out of the St. Thomas Graphics collection. Here we see this concept of virgin is an embodiment of ideas of power and gender. And so when we're thinking about ourselves as Virgin Islanders, it's important to note that the concept of virginity is actually a social construction. In actuality, there is no concrete agreed upon definition of virginity. It is not necessarily penile penetration of the vagina, nor is it necessarily the rupture of a woman's hymen. We must then consider that virginity is an imagined space in which a gender conversation often occurs. It's a frontier whose crossing becomes a rite of passage. And in the context of the Caribbean, virginity has become a visual metaphor to express a narrative of a vast wilderness or unbroken forest or a pristine paradise, as in the case of these images, and innocent natives and a space where others could exact their imagination, their dreams, their desires, etc. And in the Caribbean, virginity is a part of this allegory of discovery and a part of the colonial narrative of control. So here I'm pointing out these two images. One, it's entitled Here's How, which seems kind of like a guide to what can be done in St. Thomas and St. John. It's a description of that there's great bargains, what you can do and see, hotels, shopping, nightlife, and it's presenting, of course, this idea of leisure and to be able to consume a particular kind of lifestyle. And in the other one, we're just seeing, this kind of archetypal image of a palm tree amidst a seascape and a landscape. But I wanted to think, as we're thinking also about this idea of virginity, one of the ways that Christopher Columbus's dedication to the virgin cults of Mary and others is demonstrated in the numerous islands that he named after the Virgin. From Santa Maria de Montserrat, from Santa Maria de Antigua, which is Antigua today, Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, which is Nieves, or our own Santa Úrsula de las 11,000 Vírgenes, the Virgin Islands, we see a particular narrative encoded with gender and power relations taking root. Beginning with these early encounters and namings, the Caribbean continues to be associated with the myth of a virgin paradise. And this idea of a pristine geography that is uncharted, unexplored, and uncultivated is what motivated European exploration and subsequent exploitation. We also see in these images from the St. Thomas Graphics collection how this extends to ideas of the Pinterest tropical paradise and framing the Virgin Islands as a space of desire and consumption for the tourism economy. These colonial metaphors of virginity, order, and conquest highlight a narrative of as the landscape as a body to be consumed, yet somehow remaining a permanent virgin, much like Mary, the mother of Jesus, a body in which the intercourses that lead to pregnancy and birth have all been erased. We see that the violent histories of the Caribbean have also been erased in these images to perpetuate a doctrine of discovery and exploitation. Except this image I found really interesting. This image is entitled "After the Storm is Stilled." And it seems to be maybe a book or a pamphlet called Reflections on the Life During and After Hurricane Marilyn by Wircherly Gums, with photographs by Hilary Hodge. And I found this image really interesting because it resonated a lot with a series of work that I've developed called Storm. I have 3 different veins of the series. The second one I'm presenting here, it's Storm in the Time of the Temporal or Temporary and Spatial Collapse. And what I find really interesting about this image is that, I've been looking for ways to visualize the complications of the Black Atlantic, the Caribbean contemporary, the ethos of being a colonial being, and the potential revolution of chaos. And I'm asking what comes in and after the storm, as also what is referenced here in this image in the St. Thomas Graphics collection. How can we formulate new geographies, new conceptions of space and self? In this work, I'm looking for ways to also imagine how the Tropicalia, or these images of the Tropicalia, can be monumental, as in colossal, as in memory, as in funerary, as in heroic, as in visionary, or as in sovereign. How can we begin to transgress the temporal limitations, cross infinite spaces, invent multiple horizons, reimagine the landscapes that we live in and the sea that occupies us? How can both reenactment and reconfiguration be tools of self-possession, self-determination that embodies the narrative central to the Virgin Islands woman? So with that, I'll pass it on to Hadiya.
Thank you, Lavon. I'm also very excited, actually, that I follow you for multiple reasons, and viewers will see the continuity in terms of our thematic focus. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm generally very pleased to have the opportunity to present on this panel alongside my fellow VISCO members. And so I'd like to begin with many thanks to Ms. Sophia Aben and Mr. Rob Upson, as well as everyone at the Caribbean Genealogy Library for, 1, making today's roundtable possible, and 2, for all of the visible and invisible labor that goes into compiling and maintaining these resources for public access. So I titled my talk, Virgins, Paradise, and Revelry Rites, a gendered meditation on humanizing the dead. And I will provide a Black, decolonial, eco-feminist reading of the contents of the Caribbean Genealogy Library St. Thomas Graphics collection. And so as I reviewed the collection, I found myself having a very visceral reaction to some of the images, texts, and advertisements therein. And as a philosopher who traffics heavily in Black existentialism, Black feminist and Black queer theory, political philosophy, and environmental philosophy, I found myself meditating on questions of ecology and the relationship between nature and the colonized woman's bodies, in many ways similar to the presentation that Lavon just did. And so the Virgin Islands of the United States is, of course, a US colony, and our non-sovereignty shapes both the landscape that we inhabit, literally and figuratively. And so the question, how does our colonial context shape our culture, politics, identities, and prevailing discourses on the Virgin Islands woman and land, is a driving thread in today's talk. And so I talk about virgins, paradise, and revelry rites because the colonial order creates a dehumanizing hellscape that Black, brown, and/or colonized women must navigate as people who experience the oppressive conditions constituted by racial capitalism and heterosexist patriarchy. And so while I generally identify as non-binary, as somebody who's often read as a woman in the Virgin Islands context, I think it's critically important to interrogate the relationship between race, gender, economy, culture, and the environment. So the Virgin Islands is often called America's paradise. And this language denotes colonial possession and is very much aligned with the conceptualization of the Caribbean a bit more broadly. And so to quote Mimi Scheller's Demobilizing and Remobilizing Caribbean Paradise, quote, "The Caribbean has been repeatedly imagined and narrated as a tropical paradise in which the land, plants, resources, bodies, and cultures of its inhabitants are open to be invaded, occupied, bought, moved, used, viewed, and consumed in various ways. The Caribbean has been renaturalized as a virgin paradise in ways that continue to inform the contemporary desirability as the ultimate place to play," end quote. And so our Virgin Islands tourism industry also deploys this rhetoric of virgin territories and paradise to position our islands as competitive, i.e. as an attractive destination to visitors who are overwhelmingly white, American, and or European. And so there are poignant questions that we should continue asking about the ideological work that our name and our so-called virginity tend to do. Specifically, like, what does it mean to be from the Virgin Islands of the United States, islands named after St. Ursula and the 11,000 Virgins? And this name speaks to the long durée of the colonial order, because we, of course, were named by European colonial agents, and the name was thus reimagined as belonging to a new colonial power, the United States of America. So Dr. Richard Georges has a piece in the BVI Beacon titled "The Empire is Not Dead," and it raises similar questions about the persistence of coloniality in the British Virgin Islands. And Dr. Georges speaks about the iconography of empire, Ursula and the Virgins, but also the amnesia that normalizes our liminal position in empire. So Dr. George's words resonate very heavily with me, and I do also want to quote him, because he notes that what Virgin Islanders know by these facts is that the land that they inhabit, and the land in which we were born, the land in which they and their ancestors have labored, is not theirs. And this is a truth we know in the depths of our beings, and it is a truth that we spend our lifetimes attempting to forget. And so I'm here to ask, what are the rituals of forgetting and commemorating? And so there is a political ecology of paradise. How do land and our minds, bodies, and spirits in revelry play a critical role in either colonial amnesia or in decolonial practices of remembering? And so the virgin paradise and hegemonic conceptions of freedom play a very critical role in facilitating and concretizing the colonial order, where tourism, neoliberalism, and America's possession of us are viewed as the only viable pathway to modernity and freedom. And so in the Post-Organic Act of 1954 period of the American colonial period of our history as Virgin Islanders, it's marked very heavily by a neoliberal turn, privatization, austerity measures, the rise of individualism, and the orientation of the public towards the ideology of the free market. And this had and continues to have a significant impact on our economy, politics, culture, and environment. And so following Donald Pease's idea in the New American Exceptionalism, fantasy really plays a critical role in naturalizing historical events that we would otherwise understand as traumatic and or horrific. And so American neoliberal fantasies of American democracy often obscure some of the dehumanizing impact of imperial and colonial power. And so in the Virgin Islands context, colonialism, a process that we would largely understand to be inequitable and or problematic, is somewhat accepted or normalized under the guise that we gain freedom and mobility, and that these things come with our positionality as US colonial subjects. And so Anthony Boakes talks a great deal about America as an empire of liberty, or one specifically that constructs freedom as common sense, creates new subjectivities, and captures the desire of the subject. And so in this image on the right, specifically this marketing of paradise as freedom, one sees how desire is captured and articulated as leisure tourism rather than revolution, perhaps. And so a reading of Bogues might suggest that freedom is not necessarily the absence of domination, but rather it's a totalizing form of domination. Whereas Virgin Islanders and other marginalized people are engaging with what Foucault would call a regime of truth, where alternative ideas of what it means to be free are attempted to be foreclosed upon. And so freedom is understood in the context of access to money, to wealth, to power, to the leisure of our tourism industry, rather than an articulation of freedom that's grounded in Black LGBTQ+ and or decolonial revolution. And so in that context, tourism and coloniality are both deployed as pragmatic, common sense, and also very much inevitable. And so this raises the question, how is it that we commoditize desire? And how does our desire shape our amenability to power and or resistance? And I think that the Virgin Islands National Park stands as a very salient illustration of the deployment of the Virgin in our libidinal economy. And so in this post-1954 development decade of the Virgin Islands, the establishment of the park was proposed as an economic catalyst that could increase economic self-sufficiency. And in 1956, the establishment of the park, an initiative championed by Lawrence Rockefeller, facilitated the decline of subsistence agriculture and the rise of tourism, which led to the transformation of St. John into a luxury small island tourism economy. And so St. John is marketed as an eco-haven or a park island, as Crystal Fort Wrangler describes it. And as property values on St. John or on Park Island continue to rise, ancestral communities struggle to keep up with the property taxes and the cost of living. So over 2/3 of St. John is now occupied by the Virgin Islands National Park. And while the park is viewed as a driving force behind our nature tourism model, it also facilitates St. John's transformation from a plantation system to a luxury tourism market, one where Virgin Islanders whose ancestries predate the park find themselves increasingly displaced. And so I want to get very abstract for a second and focus on the virgin paradise aspect of the park and the current colonial landscape. And specifically, I want to argue that the virgin and paradise are figures and landscapes in after death realms. And so in Africana Studies and Political Philosophy, following Orlando Patterson's work and Achille Mbembe's work, we talk a great deal about necropolitics, politics of death, social death, civic death. And in short, those who are enslaved and racialized as Black experience dehumanizing subjection that relegates us to the realm of the quote unquote dead. i.e., we don't get all of the rights and privileges of those regarded as white, human, full citizen, and or master. And so many of our struggles for rights are oriented towards articulating our humanity and our desire to be recognized as human by those who are recognized as human, as well as the state. So colonialism essentially orders categories of thought to construct a subhuman other, and that these schemas of racial, gendered, sexual, and economic difference are solidified through the deployment of very specific ideas of what it means to be human that are tied to citizenship, identity, money, property, and the like. And so philosophically speaking, I kind of want to ask, is it possible that we as Virgin Islanders inhabit a liminal space between death and full civic life as people who are no longer enslaved, but still don't have full recognition, voting rights in our nation, or sovereignty? And if we are in this transitory space between life and death, what conceptions of the human mark our transition through liminality in what some might call the Bardo realms, or political, ontological, and spiritual spaces between death and rebirth? And so in this context, the Virgin Park Paradise serve a colonial fantasy, one where the consumers are presumed to be white American tourists, and the economy is designed specifically around tourism. And so the land is described as pristine, if not uninhabited. And if you look specifically at this text to travel agents, you see that when people are mentioned, they are the indigenous pre-colonial people of the past, rather than today's living and breathing Virgin Islanders. Next slide, please, Lavon. Thank you. And so I want to argue that revelry rights, i.e. Carnival, presents a space where contested descriptions of what it means to be human play out in the colonial order. And Virgin Islands women play a really critical role in this struggle. And so in Carnival, we see evidence of our relationship to the land, our ancestral food ways, our spirituality, artistry, language, music, beauty ideals, idea about power and politics. We also see representations of Black women as queens that to some extent disrupt the symbolic order's idealization of white femininity. And yet there are also very salient gaps in the archive. And so, for example, this image isn't captioned with the name of our proud queen. And also some of the intimacy of Black women's lives are absent in the collection. And so I'm struck by what the collection reveals about gender and the positioning of women in the Virgin Islands. Namely, non-binary identities are a bit obscured in the images and text in the collection. And then also my talk is based heavily on the 76 and 99 Carnival booklet. And so when I open them, the front end is loaded with statements by men who hold dominant positions in our political structure and cultural economy as Governor, Lieutenant Governor Calypso Kings, and Chairman of the Carnival Committee. Yet the collection also provides glimpses into the lives, performances, and labor that VI women as lay cultural historians, culture bearers, knowledge producers, politically conscious Calypsonians, culinary experts, and advocates for Carnival's revitalization played a heavy role in. And so I'm referencing Eldra Schalterbrandt's spearheading of a committee in the early 1950s to revitalize Carnival, and market woman Beryl Hill's entry in the Calypso competition, which admonished the then Governor Archie Alexander, an African-American Republican who was appointed by Eisenhower for trying to quote unquote stop Carnival. And both details on these women were brought to us by Irma Brathwaite's tight article, The Influence of African Rituals on Carnival in the Caribbean, which provides a history of Carnival, including a glimpse of the initial 1912 St. Thomas Carnival efforts to revitalize Carnival in the 50s, and details on early Carnival events. Next slide, please, Lavon. And so I think it's important to name the work that VI women did and continue to do in documenting our cultural history with careful, if not somewhat feminist attention to the important role of women in Virgin Islands history. And so I'd like to reference Deborah Brown, Romuo, and Anna Mae Comment's article on the 1999 Food Fair honoree, Eugenia Brown, as well as Lori Elsko's piece on the troupe Elsko and Associates, which was founded by Dorothy Elsko and Ruth Labite. And this tradition of doing a great deal of work in terms of documenting our cultural history continues today, I would say, with Shalana Brown coming to mind as a contemporary who does a great deal of this work. And so in Elsko's piece, we get a clear sense of a transnational network that Virgin Islands women participated in. And so Elsko and Associates, for example, participated in Carnival, collaborated with artists, received invitations from and presented their work across the Caribbean, namely Antigua, Trinidad, Tatola, Barbados, St. Martin, and St. Kitts, as well as in the US, in DC and New York, and in Europe, namely London. And so the collection reveals some of the tensions between our non-Western, Black, Indigenous, Asiatic, and our Western influences. And one illustration of this being that while Elsko and Associates' early troops had Greco-Roman themes, the image in the article is of one of their most salient pieces, titled the 1962 Danish 20-cent piece. And so this picture, which is on your screen and then blown up a bit on the right, displays a carnival float with three women named Estelle Christian, Elaine Colin, and Yvonne Phipps, standing in a coin representing Queen Mary, Queen Agnes, and Queen Matilda, i.e. Bottom Belly, who led the labor riot in St. Croix. And so this commemorative act told a very bold history of Black women's resistance to plantation systems and their racialized, gendered, and sex legacies, thereby reimagining queendom as a form of resistance. And so I want to draw on Sylvia Winter's writing on Junkanoo in Jamaica to suggest that perhaps the dichotomy between resistance and capitulation to power distracts us a bit from the real work that Virgin Islanders and Virgin Islands women in particular are doing, which is essentially humanizing those of us who have been historically regarded as chattel, object, and or dead, according to the prevailing order. in the fantasies of a colonial capitalist, heterosexist, and patriarchal order. And perhaps we are breaking the land's virginity and making our rebirth possible when we insist on holding our revelry rights in territory that is otherwise considered to be occupied. So thank you. And I'll pass the screen over to Dr. Tami Navarro, and I'll also see you all in a bit for Q&A.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to engage in conversation with my fellow VSCO members, and I thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity to engage in the material from the St. Thomas Graphics collection. Lavon, can you do the next slide, please? So this one is a bit of a departure from the kind of femininity and feminist analysis that we've been talking about, but it's key for me. So when we began VSCO some years ago, one of the things that we realized was that we wanted to have interventions at every educational level, right? So we wanted to have primary school, middle school, and at college level texts. And for me, that desire, that need for those interventions came out of the transformative experience of reading Clear the Road when I was in 4th grade in the Virgin Islands. And so many of us read that book and had our kind of worldviews expanded around who we were as Virgin Islanders and as Black people. So I chose this image, although it's a bit of a departure, really because of the timeliness of today's newly minted holiday, Juneteenth, right? And so we're in this moment, this kind of digital moment of viral hashtags, and we know we hear Black Boy Joy and Black Girl Magic, and they're kind of decoupled from the material reality of Black life. Even having a holiday like Juneteenth, when arguably the vast majority of Americans celebrating this holiday are really unaware of the kind of depths of its history and what it is really that they're celebrating. And I guess I'm showing my hand a bit to talk about my training as an economic anthropologist. So my longer and deeper work is on the EDC program, but I look at this image and I think, well, we need clearly to talk about the material realities that shape these children's lives, right? So a first blush of this picture, it's a bunch of smiling kids, Black and brown boys and girls smiling and saying, have a safe and happy summer. And yet my question is, what are their lives and what are the kinds of conditions in which they and their caregivers live that lead to their presence in this picture? And what do their lives look like outside of the kind of flash of this camera? So I'm going to read just really quickly an excerpt from the most recent, the 2020 Kids Count snapshot that was produced by the St. Croix Foundation. This is a quote. Starting in 2012 with the closure of the Hovenza oil refinery, the largest private employer in the territory. And here I'm just going to interject. I think we could also talk about the recent events of the lime tree project that has been poisoning St. Croix and what those kinds of conditions of life have been for children and their caregivers. So after the closing of Hovenza, the USVI faced a steady decline in K-12 enrollment, concurrent with the skyrocketing unemployment rate, which topped 17.8% on St. Croix in 2013. Then, just as the USVI began to show signs of recovery in 2017, 2 back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes hit the islands. In the immediate aftermath, the child enrollment in K-12 plunged from 17,286 to 14,500 children. By the time COVID-19 emerged, children and families in the territory were still rebounding from hurricanes Irma and Maria, struggling with housing insecurity amid surging rental rates, as well as battered school and hospital conditions. So I just want us to sort of take a moment and sit with that. For many of us with sort of affinity and familial and, kind of our lives are rooted and grounded in the Virgin Islands, but looking at these faces, for me, it's important that we sort of contextualize the lives that they live, the kinds of realities that they occupy, not just in a colonial reality that the US Virgin Islands is, but what it means that unemployment is so high, what it means that public education has been struggling, what it means even in this current moment of COVID-19, that school has been largely virtual, remote, impossible for them and their caregivers, which is discomforting, absolutely. But I also, I was so glad to go after Hadiya because I wanted to think and to dwell upon her notion of revelry and to return to that notion of joy, right? That these are children that are heading out for the summer, a really sort of normalized, joyful experience. They're grinning. There's somebody on the far left, a little boy who sort of almost can't wait to jump up and get out of the frame, right? And begin his summer. And so there is still that despite, right? And so I guess that's a circling back to the clear the road. I want to hold on to the kind of nuanced joy. And that's something that in this group, we have worked really hard to sort of hold at the center, the sort of revolutionary importance of something like bacchanalia, something like revelry, something like joy, informed by the material realities of life, right? So it's not a kind of superimposed, again, the hashtagification of Black girl magic, everything is wonderful, but really understanding the material inequalities, the realities that shape people's lives and the impossible conditions they face. And yet the agentive sort of moment there, the turn is that in spite of that, right, being well aware of and steeped in that history, we continue to find spaces of possibility, spaces of movement, spaces of joy, which is profoundly revolutionary. And I just wanted us to sort of think through and turn to that moment of informed joy in this moment of Juneteenth, where we're thinking through this history that is now becoming recognized and how we continue to make these lives possible and make our lives meaningful and joy-filled. So I wanted to have that departure. And then can I have the next slide, please? This one I find really interesting, and it's the first thing that jumped out to me when I was looking through the images in the collection, because here we have a white woman. I mean, it's sort of, the duality is striking, right? We have a white woman and a Black woman ostensibly both relaxing, leaning on a palm tree, right? So some attempt, I would argue, has been made at parity here, right? So we're supposed to see these women as equals. Right, sort of here is a Black woman and here's a white woman and they're on the beach enjoying the same kind of leisure. And again, I just want to sort of complicate that and think through the nuance of their realities. So I'm going to turn to someone I cite quite often. I'm going to look at Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, and she's writing from Antigua. And I'm just going to read briefly what she writes. You disembark from your plane. You go through customs. Since you are a tourist, a North American or European, to be frank, white, and not an Antiguan Black returning to Antigua from Europe or North America with cardboard boxes of much needed cheap clothes and food for relatives, you move through customs swiftly. You move through customs with ease. Your bags are not searched. You emerge from customs into the hot, clean air. You immediately feel cleansed. Immediately you feel blessed, which is to say special. You feel free. And I think that that's important to think through, right? So the kind of parody that is being suggested by this image is really undercut by the material realities that we see laid out at the bottom of this image. And in reading this image, I really was struck by some of the resonance that it has for me with Vaugh Belle's work. So even going back to the sculpture, Vaugh, that you were talking about earlier, the I Am Queen Mary, I know much of your work was on the plinth, right? That sort of that made possible then the figure of Queen Mary, that is not just sort of holding her up, but the ground upon which she is able to then sort of rest. And for me, that's what we see underneath this image of this Black woman and this white woman ostensibly engaging in leisure. So we see shopping and maps directory, shopping, sightseeing, real estate, custom regulations, history, hotels. Those are the realities that are made possible, that those are the kinds of activities. Hold on, my internet is acting.
Did we lose her temporarily?
I think we may have lost Dr. Navarro temporarily. She's about to come back in.
Maybe it might make sense for me to,
Can you all hear me?
yeah, okay.
It was a little unstable. I apologize. Apologies. Yes, so I just wanted to say that as we're looking through these two women, right, again, a Black woman, a white woman, sort of this kind of duality that's being suggested at first blush by the image, I just want us to think about what the intended audience is for a publication like this, right? Who's doing the shopping, who's doing the sightseeing, who's engaging in kind of the real estate purchases, as Hadiya pointed us to, the kinds of property tax rates that make it impossible for historically Black and Brown communities to enter the real estate market in the Virgin Islands now, hotels. And so that I just want us to think about, how do these economic imbalances, the kinds of colonial realities of history and also our contemporary moment in the Virgin Islands, how do they color an image like this, right? How do they kind of allow us to see into the possibility of what these women's lives look like, again, outside of the frame, outside of this moment, right? What are the ways in which their lives are shaped? How did they get to this position of the beach? And what does it look like when they're not in this snapshot? And for me, one of the first things that came to mind was thinking about the work of Hortense Spillers, right? Who writes that Black women are the beached whales of the sexual universe, unvoiced, misseen, not doing, awaiting their verb. And so I just want us to think about an image like this as a whole and think about all the doing that happens outside of this constructed image, right? All of the doing that has led to a moment like this, that has led to a moment like this photograph, this sort of brief glimpse of leisure on the beach, and what happens outside of the frame when they move away from this moment, and what their lives look like in a day-to-day, the kind of quotidian, I think is really important in an image like this. Thank you. So I think we're now going to, I think we have a moment to talk amongst ourselves, and then we're going to shift to Q&A. So one of the things that I wanted to ask my colleagues, because I was really struck as each of you were talking, was about the kind of positioning of your analysis. So in hearing each of you speak, I was really struck with the kinds of transnational connections that you evoked. So Tiphanie, you talked a bit about the kind of US kinship, pointing us to this Juneteenth moment, what it means to have African-American kin. Lavon, you pointed us to the sort of Danish connections of the Danish past in the US Virgin Islands. And then Hadiya, you pointed really clearly to the kind of liminality within the US that Virgin Islands residents, that Virgin Islanders experience. And so I wonder if we could just talk a bit about how we position our work and position our analyses in relation to these kinds of transnational connections. I know for all of us, we center the Virgin Islands, but what those kinds of antenna look like. Any one of you?
I guess I'll start. I think for me as a visual artist, living in St. Croix, you know, when I came back from studying in Cuba, I had gone through a really extensive and really intense training about thinking about visual arts as a way to create dialogue, to create new knowledge, to think about our collective narratives, to think about our environment. And when I came back to the Virgin Islands, one of the things that struck me the most was our coloniality, but also how it's represented in our visual landscapes, our visual iconography, the towns that we live in, the sugar mills, etc. And so a lot of my work began thinking through the materiality of coloniality. And the most dominant one is from the Danish period. And I think, so for me, you know, as you referenced, thinking about I Am Queen Mary with the coral stones, thinking about how often we see, even for example, our towns, and we characterize them as Danish, but we often forget the labor that created those towns. And so the coral stones for me were that visual representation of that, you know, finding them outside of my studio here in Frigat and Kristianstad, you know, wonder how did these cut coral stones end up in the ground? And they were actually ruins from an outhouse. And you really can see them as almost mini ready-made sculptures. And what I thought was so interesting about them is the mark of these enslaved Africans' hand is literally on them. But we often don't see them because they are the foundations of the buildings. What we see on top is the Danish brick, and we begin to think about these buildings as mostly Danish. And we often forget about the labor, and not just the labor, but all of everything else that came with the labor. The spiritual ideologies of the people who were cutting these stones out of the ocean. How did that inform how they saw that process? What did their beliefs about God or spirit or the water, how did that inform the ways that they cut these coral stones out of the ocean? And I mean, so I think that, and it's in our essence, we are transnational. The Virgin Islands is a conglomerate of pretty much every major civilization on the planet, like much of the Caribbean is. And so I think that that would, of course, inform a lot of the work that we're doing, and in particular, the work that I'm doing.
Thank you for that. Tiffany or Hadiya?
Yeah, and of course, thank you for this question, Dr. Navarro. It's funny, I actually had a similar question for us, so I'm glad that you got this out of the way. But essentially, when I think about transnationalism and how it informs my work as a Virgin Islander, I think I realize that it is personal, political, and then also academic. On a personal vein, I think my father grew up or spent most of his childhood in Ethiopia. And so my paternal grandmother is Ethiopian. And so a great deal of my early attempts to grapple with the question of sovereignty were deeply informed by what it meant for my father to kind of leave a sovereign nation as a child and to now be raised in like the non-sovereign Caribbean. And so really thinking about Blackness and all of the violent impositions that attempt to and actually effectively rob us of our sovereignty, and then the multiple efforts that we go through to seize sovereignty, whether it be political, ontological, economic, or otherwise. And in a political vein, I'm deeply attentive to questions of political status, and specifically what it means for us to be a non-sovereign territory in the Caribbean, what self-determination might look like for us, what the pathways are that are available to us, and why we hesitate on the brink of quote unquote selecting a particular decolonization option. And in order to do that work, I think it also requires us to really look at ourselves as a part of the whole. And by the whole, I think both regionally, but also our relationship in relation to the contiguous United States of America, and our relationship to the African diaspora as a whole, as well as other colonized spaces that are predominantly Black and or brown. And so there are multiple I guess, modalities, but also really interesting sites of grappling with transnationalism in a Virgin Islands context, but also in recognizing that this is not particularly new in our history. And so if we look at moments of marronage in the Caribbean, we see a great deal of movement from plantations in the quote unquote Virgin Islands to plantations in Puerto Rico or elsewhere. If we grapple even with the figures of Fayabun, so to speak, Queen Mary was not born in, the US Virgin Islands. Queen Mary's an Antiguan. And so all across our history, we have a very clear recognition that resistance and identity and belonging in the Virgin Islands, these are and have always been transnational struggles. And I think that that's deeply important to not only our identity and our belonging, but really our political practice. And so with that being said, in terms of the academic impulse, a great deal of scholarship, whether it be in Black feminism or post-colonial theory, Africana theory, is just deeply involved with grappling with how colonialism and imperialism really impacts our lives, our expressions, our ways of being in the world as African people and people of African descent. And so I think it's important to continue to draw very heavily from this tradition to really continue to think about freedom.
I would just add a little bit to what Dr. Sewer said. As VSCO, as a Virgin Islands Studies Collective, we often think about what is the Virgin Islands, when is our start points, and we've discussed over our years together as a collective that we have many different kinds of start points. And one of them that we noted, I'm going to get the date wrong, in the 1700s, the Danish West Indies, which is what we were formerly called, had the largest port and a free port in the region, the largest free port in the region, which meant that people could come and trade goods without having to pay taxes. So everybody in the region was coming and liming here in the Virgin Islands, which is to say that we were transnational, multinational from a long time. But we even understand ourselves to be multinational even now, right? We all grew up, if we grew up in the Virgin Islands, knowing people who are from all over the region, and that their regional affiliations also had, were formerly colonized by Europeans, but also their Africanness was unique and different. Whether, my people are Mende, well, we think our people came from Nigeria, ours came from Ghana, ours came from Sierra Leone, depending on the colonial realities of each place. So it seems to me that the Virgin Islands has always been multinational, and that's part of our specificity as Virgin Islanders. I think we have this idea, maybe it comes from the fact that we're kind of a small place, just to quote Kincaid again, but we have this idea that we are, that we're not sophisticated, you know, that we don't know a lot about the rest of the world. And yet so much of the rest of the world is here with us and always coming for us, and we're always going, and there's lots of back and forth. That is in our very bodies. You know, if we do our genealogy, here we are in the Caribbean Genealogy Library. Our bodies show us to be physically embodiments of transnational realities. But you know, for me, in my own work, it was important to me that my first book, How to Escape from a Leper Colony, was a pan-Caribbean book. So and I did that with very clear consciousness. I wanted to write first a book that placed the Virgin Islands within the Caribbean context. So in that story collection, and again, it's a story collection with purpose, individual stories highlight peoples and places from different parts of the region. And then I also place the Virgin Islands as primary, because I'm a Virgin Islander, but as primary to me specifically, but as part of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multinational region. That's really important to me and my work. And my next book is very rooted in Virgin Islands reality, Land of Love and Drowning. It traces our movement from Danish to US colonial rule. And my next book, Monster in the Middle, which comes out in October, specifically talks more about our US coloniality and is connecting us to the United States with more intention. But I think in the Virgin Islands, we've always been very sophisticated. And I think that's not only in the past, but I think we're very sophisticated now, sometimes more so than we really realize.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's a really interesting way to bring all those threads together in our individual work and the kinds of interventions that we're hoping to make in our collective. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hadiya Sewer, who's going to lead us in some audience Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Tami. And also, I noted that we actually do not yet have questions in the chat, but okay. I will invite you all to post questions. And while you stop and think a bit about what you would hope to be in conversation with us about, one of the questions that I do have for my fellow VSCO members is essentially, when we think of virgins, debutantes, and queens, we often imagine them to be somewhat hegemonic figures that kind of support, the dominant society's expectation of women being quote unquote put in their place, but also a place that's very much marked by class lines and respectability politics. And so I'm curious about how we each grapple with the tension between respectability and some of the more resistive counter-hegemonic ideals that show up in Virgin Islanders' configuration of the virgin, the debutante, and the queen.
Maybe I'd like to start with that, thinking about I Am Queen Mary, because one of the critiques of the sculpture was that we were taking kind of a queen that comes out of a resistance movement, and we were Europeanizing her by putting her on a pedestal and also putting her in a European port. And I think that there's some other ways of complicating that gesture and idea. I know, Tiffany, you mentioned in your presentation that, when we look at carnival traditions, Black women have always played with European ideals of femininity and tossed it around, put it on as ways to challenge the authority and their power. But when we think about that sculpture, I find it interesting that she's in workers' clothes, she's barefoot, she has a head wrap on, and she's also sitting, which for Black women in the Caribbean, your function was either you were a worker or you were breeding more workers. It's actually really a radical act for her to be sitting. And her power, although I would say that yes, the sculpture does have beauty, that's not necessarily the first thing that you see. What you're really seeing is this power, and the power that is also based not on necessarily a dramatic gesture, but the power of her interior space, because she's sitting and reflecting. And I think that that's, I thought it was really interesting, your analysis of thinking about us being in this kind of liminal space, not quite dead, not quite fully alive, and how so much of the work that we're doing is having to articulate our humanity. And I think that that is also very much a part of that sculpture as well, thinking about I Am Queen Mary as an articulation of basic humanity, which, declaring your presence of who you are, which we see has been a resistant tactic, even if we're thinking about the 1968 sanitation worker strikes, where they have the placards, I am a man. And then we see it in another way when we're thinking about, when I lived in Cuba, children would have to say, seremos como el Che, kind of connecting. So not just I am, but we are like, and in this case, it would be Che Guevara. So yeah, I'm curious what others think.
I think it's so interesting, following up on what you're saying, Lavon, because the way that you phrased the question, Hadiya, the kind of tensions between respectability and rebellion or revolution. What if we sort of invert the question, right? And what does it mean when the act of rebellion is in fact to inhabit respectability, as Tiphanie points us to, right? So what you started with, Tiff, was looking at Betsy Resende's work and thinking about the tool and putting on the kinds of armor of femininity, right? Which was for those kinds of possibilities were meant to be foreclosed to Black women. So when the rebellion is inhabiting the kind of, white femininity, then the question begins to become, the ground then begins to sort of shift a bit. But it is about a kind of fluency, right? And I choose that word very carefully, the kind of armor of femininity, because I think that Black women have long had a kind of fluency with the kinds of power available to them, right? And they could kind of remix it, right? So they could put on the kind of gown, they could, Tiphanie, in other work we've done together, you talked about the kinds of bows that women could do, right? And how it could be used to either show a kind of daintiness or strength, right? So there's a kind of nimbleness in the way that Black women in the Virgin Islands have engaged with these kinds of representations of womanhood that they've been steeped in, right? Things that are supposed to be unavailable to them, they've kind of dabbled in and used. I'm thinking right now of Cynthia Oliver's work, and we've each worked with Cynthia in her work, Queen of the Virgins, where she talks about the ways that these kinds of forms of beauty pageants have been not even imploded, but sort of they've served as spaces of intervention where ideas about Blackness, ideas about strength, ideas about beauty can sort of be inserted, and then they shift. Then the form itself becomes different. Then what is being celebrated, right? What we're calling femininity, what we're calling rebellion, those things don't mean the same thing anymore because they represent different kinds of both aesthetic. They represent a different both aesthetic image, but also kind of the actions that people are. And that even what you were saying before, Tiphanie, about the leadership, right? What does that mean when somebody's talking about their career or their future as a leader in a space that is meant to be celebrating their virginity, right? Or their sort of entrance into proper society. So I think that Black women, again, have had a kind of facility for a long time with taking advantage of these avenues that have been open to them.
We're getting some interesting questions.
Yeah, and I was going to say, specifically, I really appreciate your attention to questions of fluency in particular. With that being said, we do have a question from Sarah Figueroa in the chat. And that question is, how do Latino Virgin Islanders fit into this framework in our opinion?
I'm not sure which island Sarah is on. But one thing, so I'll come at this question from sideways and then hopefully those of you, the rest of the collective can answer it in a more direct way. But in St. Thomas, we have the Frenchy community on that one. And our Frenchy community would phenotypically maybe present as white to any statesider, but to Virgin Islanders, that the word white would not apply to Frenchies, right? We wouldn't use that term to think about our fellow Virgin Islanders who happen to be from Frenchtown or Northside and of French descent. So I often think about Frenchies, maybe Cushion Puerto Ricans in this way as phenotypically presenting as white, but often like presenting as Virgin Islanders, as as like putting on and taking off Virgin Islanderness with sometimes more nimbleness than even the rest of us, probably because of the phenotypical allowance that allows them to transfer back and forth, but the kind of passing that a Frenchie might be able to do when they go to the States, the way that Black Virgin Islanders sort of pass into African Americanness, that Frenchies might pass into white Americanness. But when you're here in St. Thomas, there's no desire to pass. In fact, there's a desire to absolutely not pass, right? And to be rooted in Virgin Islanderness. So to me, the question, my response to it might be that, at least in the St. Thomas context, Frenchies are often heralding Virgin Islands traditions, maybe more than Virgin Islanders who pass as African Americans. For various kinds of historical reasons having to do with class but also with race, that these communities are doing the same kinds of work of debutanting. I mean, when I was in my debutante ball, there were at least 2 Frenchies in the 1995 alongside us. And as we all know, that there are women who again might pass for white, who we don't think of as white, who are running in queen pageants and winning pageants. So in my mind, the conversation is the same, that we are presenting various types of Virgin Islanderness. And maybe in fact, the fact that communities that don't often look Black are part of our Virgin Islanderness with the same strength and fervor is another sign of your earlier question, Tami, having to do with the reality of our multinationalism. That to be a Virgin Islander has always meant to be from many places, to be representing many past histories.
Yeah, and I'll just interject really quickly. When the person asked the question, I knew that she was going to say she's on St. Croix, just because the kinds of histories of mobility and proximity to St. Croix. And one of the things that is a big part of Crucian culture is the VIPR, the Virgin Islands Puerto Rico Friendship Day, right? So there is the kinds of crowning of Miss VIPR, and there's all kinds of cultural events around that. And one of the things that I think that raises for the kind of conversation we're having here, which hasn't come up yet, we've been talking about a real binary of Black and white, is the issue of colorism, right? And how Afro Puerto Ricans or Afro Latina women in particular are represented, or what is seen as a prize aesthetic in those kinds of competition. I'm thinking of Ms. VIPR in particular. Yeah. So I think we could think through the issue of colorism more broadly in the kind of debutante and desirable women conversation we've been having.
I think it goes beyond that too, because of course in the St. Croix we have, and also I believe in St. Thomas and St. John, we have an increasingly growing Dominican population. And so I don't think that necessarily is so much about colorism as it is also about thinking through our, I don't know what the word would be, our possibly even xenophobia in some ways that exists in the Virgin Islands as well. Because I know, we have these disparaging terms to separate, like in some ways we feel that Puerto Ricans are more Virgin Islander than Dominicans are, because maybe they're the newest immigrant and they're also the immigrant group that also looks quote unquote more Black. But I feel that even with that, they also have experienced a lot of discrimination in terms of, even the term santo that we typically use. I don't know if it's so popular in St. Thomas and St. John, but it's very much used here in St. Croix as a way of distancing them. And also, it's a way of also distancing. And so I think that, it isn't necessarily about equating Virgin Islander with Black, although oftentimes we know words like local is code word for Black. And so when we're kind of talking about belonging, we're talking about often a space of Blackness. And so I felt that maybe that question was kind of trying to complicate that idea about, is that what we're also saying, that Virgin Islanderness, what is the relationship between Virgin Islanderness and Blackness? And, Hadiya, I know that you probably have lots to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitively have a lot to say about that, but in the interest of time, I'll keep it very brief, which is in short to say that I think sometimes it's important to recognize that our Virgin Island, or Blackness and Latinidad are not mutually exclusive categories. And so in really grappling with some of the areas of overlap, but also some of the historical and contemporary distinctions, I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about Virgin Islanders and Virgin Islands women in particular, if we're speaking about a body that is racialized, colonized, gendered, and sexed, those are quote unquote marked differences that we share. And so in grappling with some of the hierarchies that may exist between us, whether we are speaking about nationality or whether we are speaking about how hegemony influences language, or even some of the xenophobia that you're referencing, Levon, I think it's important to trace those while also recognizing some of the ways in which coloniality really traffics in establishing colonial borders and distinctions that are designed to divide us from a certain level of like mutual recognition. And so in tracing our history and our understanding of ourselves, I think it becomes really important to always acknowledge that both Blackness and Latinidad are very much a part of who we are individually and collectively, while also thinking through just some of the ways in which historically Latin American and English-speaking Caribbean racial classification systems shared certain attention to a racial continuum, right? And so in the contiguous United States, we have like what we call the binary, where you're Black or you're white. End of discussion. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, especially also even in the Danish West Indies, we have this continuum where people can be Black, they can be quote unquote brown, they can, and we start to actually quote unquote historically quantify how people exist on the spectrum between quote unquote Blackness and whiteness. And so with that being said, I do think it is important to recognize that Latina Virgin Islanders are very much a part of our conceptualization of Virgin Islandness and the Virgin Islands woman in particular. And so with that being said, we do have a question from Desiree Ross that I'd like to pose to my fellow VSCO presenters, which is essentially, please expand on your thoughts on today's tourism, incorporating Carnival into their strategy and the influences from neighboring Caribbean or neighboring islands. Is it a rebellion or a Caribbean woman's sexual stance? Is it economic? How would you grapple with that? And if you're looking for the text in the chat, it's timestamped at 3:35 p.m. if you would like to scroll up.
I feel like that question, it feels like it's also talking about, because the question says, in today's tourism, incorporating Carnival into their strategy and the influences from neighboring islands. I'm wondering if they're really referencing kind of the trinification of Carnival. And how there's often this debate that happens after Carnival about the ways that women are using their bodies and the increasing sexual sexual display that people find that's occurring in Carnival. And I'm curious, that's part of what I hear in this, and then kind of questioning around the Caribbean woman's sexual stance. Like, is there a form of rebellion in that position of having a very free display of your sexuality? Is that how you guys maybe understand the question?
I read it. It's so
I'm
funny. I think this is like an instance of our kind of worldview showing, because I read it as much more of an economic intervention. And I thought, of course, you know, it's not that tourism, the Department of Tourism is sort of doing an overreach to try to now incorporate Carnival. It's just a realization of the history of Carnival as a commodity, right? So we have to think about the transformation of the Virgin Islands from an agrarian economy to, you know, with the closing of Cuba, to American tourists in the 1950s, to a tourism-based economy, and the kinds of ways that traditional practices that we would, you know, now argue fall in the rubric of tourism were expanded, right, to then become much more desirable to white tourists who were now in search of a sort of place to spend their leisure and holiday dollars, right? So it's not a kind of overreach of an economic arm saying we're going to use our cultural creativity to welcome tourists. That's a full circle moment, right? That is sort of how it came to be in the current iteration that we understand Carnival today, that is just an expansion on the history of Carnival in the Caribbean more broadly, right? So all these dollars are up for grabs, and people thought, well, what are the kind of flashiest ways that we can make people want to come here? Again, borrowing in this kind of bricolage moment, borrowing in a kind of pan-Caribbean cultural practices with particularly unique like spins on it for each island, but it really is an economic, in my reading, it really was an economic competition for these newly available dollars.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things I found really interesting in looking at the St. Thomas Graphics collection was realizing the extent to which tourism in the Virgin Islands has almost always incorporated Carnival from neighboring islands and spaces in their strategy. And so even thinking of the early 1912 establishment of Carnival before it died off, that was influenced by Carnival in Brazil. And then also when you look at Elsko and Associates, for example, a great deal of their development of costumes and floats and thematic focus came from their travels and collaboration with individuals in Trinidad. And so I think it becomes really a beautiful kind of like way of realizing the transnational origins of our Carnival practice historically, while kind of thinking about how we may be collectively influenced by the economic like imperatives of our times. And so specifically thinking about costumes becoming quote unquote increasingly flashy and revealing due to the economy, as Dr. Navarro, you're pointing out. But one of the things I'm also, I think, really fascinated by and hoping to center is this question of whether or not rebellion and sexuality are mutually exclusive. And I think that one of the things I would like to argue is that, you know, I don't know that rebellion and sexuality are mutually exclusive. I think that sex is a political practice in as much as it is an intimate practice. And so with that being said, I feel like if we go back to this question of how do we grapple with capitulation to power or resistance, and then really center this question of humanization, one of the things that we can start to recognize in at least a Virgin Islands context is that some of the ways in which we express our sexuality, explore and or express or display our bodies, that some of these things may be a capitulation to power, and they may also be very much grounded in our own desires, and that there's something that could possibly be freeing and also objectifying simultaneously about the practice. And so I think it's a really great question. And so thank you for asking it.
Yeah, I also think a lot about, oh, sorry, Tiffany, go ahead.
I would want to go back even to that Eddie and the Movements / jam band song Legal, where, you know, and I really appreciate Dr. Navarro telling us, giving us the history of Carnival, noting that it was maybe, as we understand Carnival in the Virgin Islands today, was always in response to tourist dollars. And yet inside of that, even though we know that this is what the Carnival is for, we're still actively saying, but we're not going to do Carnival for the tourist color, as Friday says in the song Legal, right? We're not going to do-si-do. We're not going to do it like this. We're not going to behave nice. We're going to behave how we feel. We're going to go on bad. We're going to do what we want. And that's an important part of it, that yes, we understand that we are in some ways singing for our supper, but that we're going to do it in a way that at least allows us to feel our own humanity. And I do think that embodied in feeling our own humanity, expressing it the way that we desire to express it, is about saying, like, the Virgin Islands woman's body, to bring us back to our subject, is beautiful and not to be a thing of shame, no matter what form it comes in. You know, when people often have asked me things, I remember going to the States for the first time, are Virgin Islands women very confident in their bodies? And I always felt like, but yeah, because you walking down the street in half naked and you don't care how, and you're just happy in your body. And I think while we may look at that and say, well, these women are being subjugated, they're being objectified, there is also the reality that you're dancing in the middle of the street and you feel safe. You're with your cousins and your aunties and maybe your children, your parents, all together dancing in the streets. And what is more an embodiment of freedom and safety than dancing half naked in the street? So to me, that feels very rebellious, even though we also understand it to also be, you know, an sometimes economic imperative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, you know, Hadiya, when you were talking about revelry and the rights of revelry, I remember when I was in Trinidad, I had gone to this, it was for like this, a bunch of artists from different parts of the world to come in and experience Trinidad's Carnival. And there was a woman from China who was watching Carnival for the first time. And for her, she was like, oh, this is like sex dancing. And next thing I know, Ying Mei had turned around and she was tongue kissing somebody on the street she didn't know. And I had to grab Ying Mei and be like, Ying Mei, no, this is not sex dancing. It may look like sex dancing, but there's particular rules and orders. Like, we're not doing that. And I think that that's also, it made me laugh because it was kind of this, I think what we're highlighting is that there is this experience of, even within that framework, we all know that that's not necessarily how Virgin Islands women dance every day, or even go on the street every day. We're not going to be necessarily dressed like that. We do have, it is a particular right of freedom. I think that's kind of what I wanted to highlight. And that right has a particular norms and mores as well.
Okay, agreed. I think the next question, we do have some very insightful comments and questions in the chat. And so I do also invite everyone to read along. So you can catch the questions or comments that we may not necessarily get to. And with that being said, we're going to go to Ijeoma Ofoha's question. In the context of today's discussion, how does spirituality play into how VI women see themselves today versus in the past? Surely that plays a role in the journey to womanhood maturity in general. Curious to know the panelists' thoughts.
Spirituality.
I think if I were to answer that first, I think one of the things that's worth noting is that many people, at least in my generation, find ourselves having increasing conversations about like our relationship to the church and how that may be quote unquote shifting in this contemporary moment. And so I appreciate the attention to spirituality, which is of course somewhat distinct from the attention to religion. With that being said, one of the most beautiful things that I've always appreciated about Carnival and our Carnival history are just some of the spiritual ideas and practices that survive, quote unquote, the transatlantic slave trade through our cultural practice of revelry. And so if we think about the Mokojumbi in particular, if we think about masquerading as a whole, we know that there is some like historical connection to West African spirituality and how we might understand, like, let's say a gungun masquerading ancestral rites, as well as spirits or jumbis of protection in continental African villages. And so I think with that being said, it's hard, I would believe, to make a sweeping argument for how the Virgin Islands woman engages with the question of spirituality. But I think what I would say is that there are many aspects of our worldview that are very much governed by our attention to what some people might call the spiritual and its relationship to the quotidian or the day-to-day. And so, yeah, I think that's how I would begin to answer that question, but I'm also curious about what you all might think.
I would respond in the folk song that we all learn as children, Queen Mary, Aweri Gongabon. We are literally talking to spirit. I mean, we're talking to a person who's passed on, and this is one of the first things that really embody our childhood consciousness, is that there's a woman named Queen Mary and that we are talking to her and that she is talking to us, which is very much a part of West African spiritual beliefs. And, you know, in terms of the ways that we tend to remember resistance and rebellion is often, as I mentioned before, through reenactment, which one could also understand a lot of Lukumi traditions and other West African traditions to be a form of these reenactments of various orishas and spirits. And I think I mean, whatever religious practice people have, I think that's a really interesting collective consciousness that ties Virgin Islanders together, that kind of belief in talking to spirit. I mean, we do it through that song, and I think we also do it in many of our reenactment traditions of resistance and rebellion.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I also read it not so much as religion, but about spirituality, and not limited to just sort of recognition of the ancestral plane and being in a kind of ongoing dialogue with ancestors, but also the connection to land, right? So one of the things that we've talked about amongst ourselves as VSCO members is the centrality of belonging in the Virgin Islands and the kind of grounding that many Virgin Islanders understand, the kind of connection to the physical space of the Virgin Islands. So I remember several years ago when this bluff, when Grassy Point was going to be cordoned off and sold to a private investor, right, who's going to build a home out there. And there was this uproar because for many Crucians, this was one of those spaces of communing with nature, right? So tracing back to these histories of maroon communities, right? Being in conversation, being in communion with the land, with the sea, understanding oneself as part of that larger kind of organism, right? Of organic matter of life, that is an element of spirituality, that kind of grounding, that kind of belonging to the Virgin Islands in a very physical way. I understand also as a kind of spiritual practice, right? Seeing oneself as in communion with the space that we inhabit. That's what I think for me, that's what so much of the belonging is about.
I also don't want to assume that we all understand what some of the spiritual references in Carnival actually are about. So Hadiya was saying, you know, obviously the Mokojumbi, but I don't know if everybody really knows how the Mokojumbi is as a reference to the spirits. I mean, I'm not the historian on the panel in any way, but I would like to just say that, you know, my son is a Mokojumbi in the Mokojumbis of Atlanta. It's the VI Mokojumbis of Atlanta, which is where we live. But he is being taught that the Mokojumbi, or the Jumbi, we all know is a spirit that's sometimes troublesome and tricky, might actually cause negativity in your life. But the Mokojumbi is understood to be a human, usually male, but sometimes female too, who takes on the Jumbi dress and Jumbi-ness, and is the Moko, the Mak Jumbi, in order to protect us, right? So the Mokojumbi is actually art form that we understand as a spiritual one in order to protect us from the actual Jumbi. So that is, you know, that's part of Carnival's spiritual roots, but even things that we often undermine as being sort of simplistic, like the wild clowns, which I was a clown in Carnival 2 years, that even the way that the clothing of the clown is made and the way that you're covered is all supposed to be about your ghostliness. You're also a protector, but you're a troublemaker at the same time. You carry a whip with you, which if you think about 16-year-olds carrying whips in the middle of Carnival, it's hilarious, absurd, and yet that's what you're doing. And your whip is there to protect. But you are also an embodiment of a spirit, which is part of why your costume is so gauzy and why you cannot be seen. So, you know, even within Carnival, there are these things that have spiritual resonance that sometimes we don't even realize that we're enacting this stuff, but it's there. It's there in the culture, and we are reenacting it and enacting it, you know, every year in Carnival. Although not this year because of COVID, but soon come.
Yes, and I know that we are definitively at the 4 o'clock mark, and so we technically do not have time for more questions, which I'm definitively sad about, because there's a very insightful question on non-binary VI identities and where we are in this contemporary moment. And so I appreciate that. As a comment, especially as we grapple with the question of womanhood. I don't know that there's like a definitive stance or response, but I think that Virgin Islanders who identify as like non-binary, trans, and or otherwise like gender fluid are increasingly carving out spaces for asserting one's identity and having our participation in Black transnational conversations around feminism, but also about our queer theory. And so I think that there are increasing spaces for that conversation and for people to identify safely. However, I would also say that that probably isn't where we are in this particular time and space. And so I do look forward to like more conversations about troubling the gender binary in a Virgin Islands context. And I think it's specifically important in reading archives and other collections, because technically we don't really know how everyone in the archive identifies in terms of gender. We get certain impositions by the state. There's a certain level of space for self-identification, but we're really, I think, reading gender from our particular vantage point without being able to have clear and insightful conversations with Virgin Islanders who may identify as non-binary or trans in the archive, but that's somewhat lost to the way that data has been collected on them. So thank you for that question. And also thank you everyone for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to have you all here. I want to thank the VSCO for their inspired conversation today. This conversation obviously is going to continue. So I posted their Facebook page into the chat if you want to follow them and see what they're up to next. Also, there's a link there for the website for today's talk, where we'll be posting the video soon and the full bios, and you can get the detailed pictures from some of the St. Thomas Graphics Collection publications that they've referenced today. So a standing ovation, a round of applause. Really appreciate the conversation, and we thank you everybody for your participation today. We'll leave the meeting open for a little while if you want to take a look through the chat, but otherwise we're signing off. Goodbye.
No, thank you.